Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Continuing Education, SOCE, Diploma Postgraduate Diploma Programs, Postgraduate Diploma Program in Rural Development, PGDRD, Revised, Compulsory Course, MRD to 01 Rural Development, Indian Context, Block-1 Rural Society, Unit-4 Rural-Urban Linkages, 4.0 Aims and Objectives. This unit aims at revealing the nature of rural-urban linkages in India in terms of their conceptualization, sectors and dimensions, major links and impact. This unit enables you to times understand the concepts of rural, urban, and rural-urban linkages, times appreciate the factors in rural-urban linkages, times comprehend the nature of rural-urban linkages in various dimensions of life in India, times identify principal links connecting the rural and urban societies in India, times assess the continuity and change in the rural and urban societies. 4.1 Introduction. In the preceding 3 units, you have been acquainted with rural society, rural social structure, and rural economy. As you know that these rural, social and economic units and structures have links not only between them but also with their external environment. So, rural society in India is not an entity in total isolation. Rather, in course of its evolution over thousands of years, its linkages with the external entities like city have further strengthened due to people's migration and mobility in search of better opportunities as well as development of transport and communication, including recent digital communication revolution. This unit will explain rural-urban linkages in India. Let us first understand the terms rural and urban. 4.2 Rural and urban. The two terms, rural and urban, are relative. Therefore, they can be understood in relationship of each other. Each one refers to a society that is formed in a distinct ecological setting. Hence, society formed in rural ecology is called rural society, and the one formed in urban ecology is known as urban society. Rural ecology is close to the nature and land, bearing comparatively much less alterations, whereas urban ecology or city is artificial, cultured, form of the nature. Thus, the two societies are chiefly distinguished by their ecology. They are distinguished in the following comparison. V.K. Srivastava 2005, 315-49. 1. Rural society is smaller than urban society in terms of both population and physical area. Rural society may or may not have modern institutions like police station, dispensary and hospital, school, post, office, club, etc. If they exist, they are inadequate or lacking the facilities that are found in its urban counterpart. 2. Rural society has low density of population that may be clustered on the basis of social status. That is, the people occupying the same status may share the same neighborhood and may observe considerable social and, sometimes, physical distance from others, especially those who are positioned low in caste class power hierarchy. On the other hand, the urban population is large in size, heterogeneous in composition, and secular in attitude. 3. A sizable rural population is engaged in agriculture, which is the mainstay of rural life. Besides, rural society has several other groups engaged in various arts and crafts, usually known as artisans and crafts persons, who regularly supply their services to agriculturists in exchange for food grains and cereals. Contrary to this, urban population is largely engaged in secondary, manufacturing, and tertiary, servicing occupations. 4. Rural society has some full-time and a large number of part-time specialists. Craftsmen and artisans also indulge in agricultural pursuits, especially during the monsoons. The agricultural produce of small agriculturists is mainly for domestic consumption, whereas manufactured goods and services in urban society are meant for supply in market. 5. Rural society is regarded as the repository of traditional mores and folkways. It preserves traditional culture, and many of its values and virtues are carried forward to urban areas, of which they become a part, after some alterations. The maximum Indian population lives in villages. This denotes that villages are the abodes of majority of Indians. The villages preserve the fundamental values of Indian society and transmit them to towns and cities. One cannot have an idea of India's spirit without understanding Indian villages. On the other hand, urban society is forward-looking and future-oriented as compared to the backward-looking and slow-changing rural society. Thus, the terms rural and urban signify to societies with certain visible differences of setting, social relations and values. Relationship between the two societies has been changing and so perceived differently over the times. Let us discuss changing perception of their relationship. 4.3 Rural-urban relationship, changing perception. The rural and the urban are part societies that form a whole society. Instead of being static, they interact with each other and have evolved in terms of size, structure and activities over the centuries due to internal and external forces which have influenced their interrelationship as well. This evolving relationship perceived at different historical phases has received different labels such as rural-urban dichotomy, rural-urban continuum, rural-urban interactions, rural-urban articulations, rural-urban nexus and rural-urban linkages. Dichotomous constructions of human society are as old as social sciences, wherein the two societies are viewed as formed of distinctive, often contradistinctive elements. Numerous familiar distinctions made between primitive and civilized societies are found based on number and diversity of social groups such as Ferdinand Tony's Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, Emile Durkheim's Mechanical and Organic Solidarity, Sir Henry Manet's Status and Contract, and Herbert Spencer's Militant and Industrial Societies. This conceptualization poses rural and urban communities as the polar opposites with no link between them. The dichotomous perspective neglects the existence of continuous, interdependent, complementary and overlapping relationship of the rural and the urban. However, the scheme of folk-urban continuum that came into existence from 1930 onwards was a systematic and conscious attempt to highlight inadequacy of the dichotomous notion. It argued that societies could be arranged on the basis of their increasing or decreasing complexity. Robert Redfield, 1930, defined an ideal type, folk society, as the polar opposite of urban society and kept rural society in between. Folk society is small, isolated, non-literate and homogeneous, with a strong sense of group, solidarity and traditional, spontaneously uncritical and personal behavior. Minor, 1952. Definitive qualities of the urban type are then left as the logically opposite to those which characterize the folk society. Redfield usually refers to urban society as modern urbanized society. The idea implicit in using this pole is that it stands for urbanized society in general and that modern Western urban society in particular. In the studies by Tepoztlán, 1930, and Yucatán, 1940, in Mexico, they have concluded that increase of contact brings about heterogeneity in and disorganization of culture, which is one sufficient cause for secularization and individualism. The folk-urban continuum deals with the problems of relative degree of presence or absence of polar characteristics, which vary not only between cultures but also within them. Thus, the real societies, which vary in terms of constituent elements, are conceptualized to be lying in between the two polar opposites of folk and urban societies on a continuum. The folk-urban continuum did highlight the continuity between the rural and the urban in terms of increasing or decreasing complexity, but falling short of revealing relationship of interdependence between the two societies. This scheme is also not quite free from the dichotomous perception of the rural and the urban. After the Second World War, many countries which were ruled by the Western colonial powers attained independence. In the wake of the planned development activities initiated in these newly liberated countries, the social scientists experienced a lot of newly emerging areas of interactions, besides the traditional ones, between the rural and the urban society in these countries. Recent changes in political, religious, and economic sectors of life have added an urban component in rural life. The nature of rural communities, therefore, call for a re-examination of the efforts of understanding their interactions with other similar communities and urban centers. Srinivas examined the spread of classical great tradition of the literati, from national to regional and then to the local levels. He conceptualized how the upper strata could provide the model of ritual behavior which is emulated at lower levels through a process that he called Sanskritization. He opines the emulation usually takes place in the situation of improvement in economic or political position of the group concerned due to its contact with a source of the great tradition. When a caste-subcaste attempts to move upward in the local hierarchy, very often it faces opposition by the dominant caste in the village or region. Makim Marriott used the concepts like parochialization and universalization to locate the downward and upward movements of influences from the little and great traditions respectively. Marriott looked into the form a trait underwent in the process of devolution, he called parochialization. He also pointed out the complementary process of universalization by comprehending the way in which a local or lowly tradition could become wider and more sophisticated. Though interactions between the rural and the urban society have always existed, the social scientists took a long time to look beyond the village and perceive these interactions. The perspective of rural-urban interactions brought into relief multiple and ever-going interactions between the two societies. When focused on the interactions between the rural and the urban, it is not a question of rural versus urban. Rather, it is a quest to know the way the rural is interacting with the urban and vice versa. Rural life centered round families, kin groups, castes, and religious groups is enriched through its urban contacts in economic, educational, political, and ritual spheres. Modernizing agencies operate through banks, state legislation, planning, and mass media in village. Village is not an isolated entity in itself. Through its urban components, it can be seen in an active interaction with city. Both the entities, rural and urban, need to interact with each other. They have either extended the scope of interactions of their social institutions or developed the requisite social networks to cope with the situations. The interactions are reflected through a mutual exchange system of goods and services between the two sectors. The ruralites are dependent on the urbanites for their banking and credit needs, for purchase of agricultural equipment and other supplies, for marketing of farm products, and even for commercial recreation. In the same way, the urban sector is dependent on the rural sector for food supply or cheap labor for the vast market of its manufactured goods, for sale of skills and technical knowledge, and for provision of administrative functions. Surplus rural wealth beyond the needs of meeting subsistence is reinvested into agriculture in the form of machinery and modern inputs. For this purpose, the villagers establish urban connections through adult franchise, institutions of local government, and participations in general elections. These connections add new varieties to polity, as well as are used to realize their interests. Life in the villages that revolved round ritual cycle of the life. The regional festivals have found new vistas in the use of technology, trucks, tractors, buses, motorcycles, decorations, and electronic media. Growing commercialization of agriculture both in food crops and cash crops is evident in the acquisition of new technology and the growing urban institutions in the villages. Chauhan 1990. The emerging new lifestyle of the villagers reflects the cultural assimilation between ruralites and urbanites. The extension of schooling and medical, transport and communication facilities to rural areas has reduced the gap, and the relations between the rural and the urban no longer remain antagonistic. Though the older generation by habit wanted to remain rural, the new generation looks towards the city for better educational and career opportunities or adopting new lifestyles. The rural urban interactions broadly comprise three aspects, namely, the nature of activities exploitative or cooperative, the spheres of activities such as economic, political, and cultural, and the traditional or modern way in which the rural urban interactions are reflected. Social structure is the best tool to confine the fields of interaction to the territory of an entity, but when these fields cut across each other's boundaries and territory of the community, it is weak as a tool of analysis. Network and modes of production are two other important approaches to understand rural urban relations. The term network, introduced first by Radcliffe Brown, 1965, while defining social structure as a complex network of relations, but John Barnes first used it as an analytical tool to analyze Norwegian island parish by dividing it into three fields, viz., the stationary field dominated by the domestic, agricultural, and administrative areas, the fluid field dominated by industrial area, and the third field that linked the other two, termed as social network, 1954 to 37. Emphasizing the relevance of the concept of social network in the analysis of articulation connectivity between rural and urban communities, B.R. Chauhan found this concept useful in analyzing the cultural, political, administrative, and economic dimensions of the social phenomenon. He has extensively shown various rural-urban interactions and intermediaries in day-to-day life in the villages of western Uttar Pradesh. By the end of the last century, the rural-urban interactions in India received new labels like rural-urban articulations, Chauhan 1990, and country town nexus, Sharma 1997. In the recent few decades, a new term, rural-urban linkages, has emerged for the rural-urban relationship. Let us discuss the rural-urban linkages in India. 4.4 Rural-urban linkages, the era of liberalization, privatization and globalization that started in India in 1990s, accompanied by advent of new technologies in the areas of communication, information, new media, transport, and consumerism, intensified the rural-urban interactions and gave rise to far better physical, psychic, social, cultural, economic and political connectivity between the rural and urban societies in the wake of reduction of distance, time and cultural barriers. With these developments, the relationship between the rural and the urban is being perceived in the form of their connections that are conceived through the term rural-urban linkages, giving an impression that rural and urban are connected in various ways rather than being segregated. This term in a way subsumes most of the earlier concepts like rural-urban continuum, rural-urban interactions, rural-urban articulations, and village-town nexus. The term linkage refers to a link or connection between two things or to the act of linking or connecting them. Thereby, the term rural-urban linkages denotes connections between the rural and urban societies or the acts of connecting them. Connections or linkages between the two societies are caused by various factors and in different dimensions of the two societies. Let us first identify factors causing rural-urban linkages in India. 4.4.1 Rural-urban linkages in India. In India, rural-urban linkages have ever existed in cultural, political, and economic dimensions. In the traditional culture of India, the existence of the literate great tradition and its relation to the little traditions in the rural setting has been highlighted by Makim Marriott, 1955. The concept of Sanskritization, Srinivas 1973, too, is a case of connection between lower and higher cultural groups. Later, B.R. Chauhan's 1970, Towns in the Tribal Setting and Yogeshital's 1971, Local Communities and National Politics have illustrated the linkages between towns and villages. Chauhan, 1970, Atal 1971. Most of the studies on rural-urban connections seem to have proceeded along channels of communication and culture. But the massive developmental and democratization have further differentiated channels, linkages, and dimensions in the post-independence period of India. So the rural-urban linkages perceived in different sectors and sectors of social life in India are being discussed here. 4.4.2 Sectors and dimensions of rural-urban linkages. Connections of a villager with the wider world are reflected in an immediate regional setting that consists of both the rural and urban counterparts. The connections have both traditional and modern elements. Based on these elements, the rural-urban contacts can be seen in two broad sectors of activity, viz. I. Traditional sector and 2. Modern sector. The traditional links connecting the rural and the urban have existed through administrative office, a small market, and the urban pilgrim centers, whereas modernized sector consists of the activities like sale of commercial crops and purchase of valuable goods, education, and health. Furthermore, the rural-urban linkages in these two sectors can be arranged broadly along three dimensions of life, namely I. Cultural dimension, 2. Administrative and political dimension, and 3. Economic dimension. Chauhan, 1990. Notably, revolution in information and communication technologies and improvement in transport means in the recent decades have further strengthened the rural-urban linkages in the modernized sector along all the dimensions. These sectors and dimensions of rural-urban linkages are being discussed here. Cultural dimension. Interconnections are found between the classical great traditions of the literate and the little traditions of the illiterate folk. These traditions are spread from the national to the regional and to the local levels. In many cases, the upper strata could provide a model of behavior along ritual lines to be emulated at lower levels through Sanskritization. It indicates the downward flow of ritual behavior and values in which a trait of great tradition undergoes devolution or parochialization. On the other hand, a local or lowly tradition becomes wider and more sophisticated through its upward movement or universalization. Hence, the cities reflect regional traditions in their most sophisticated form with regard to the specialization of actors, places, and themes. The religious centers connect the city's sacred traditions, increasing specializations among performers with the diversification among visitors or devotees. One can see the sacred centers emerged as the meeting points of urban centers and rural hinterlands, along with the development of institutions like dharmshalas, inns, and professional priests. With the improved means of communication, the density of pilgrimages has now increased along with the further spread of rural-urban interactions as well as the agencies facilitating them. One finds increasing use of modern technology like tractors and trolleys, two- and four-wheelers, and hired buses to convey people to regional pilgrimage or melicenters or to carry wedding parties. In the celebrations of the rituals of the life cycle, particularly marriage and death ceremonies, the villagers arrange feasts, exchange gifts, and enter into multiple interactions with the nearby urban centers. Large villages have developed supporting centers for urban links in these matters which facilitate rural-urban connections. In the value system of the villagers, the greater urban content in menus, gifts, or entertainment at the ceremonies and in other rural ways of life has become the symbol for status enhancement. The rural people make use of the urban ethos in interactions, secure prestigious band of music from towns, use appropriate film music, display fireworks, employ expert cooks from outside to introduce certain urban varieties of dishes and invite urban guests and political leaders. Gifts to bridegrooms include motorcycles, or cars, costly wristwatches, clothes made of synthetic fibers, and electrical gadgets like radios, fans, TV sets, refrigerators, etc. Gifts to brides include ornaments, usually obtained from urban jewelers, saris of either silk or nylon, household decorations including furnitures like double beds, sofa sets, dressing tables, and kitchen utensils of stainless steel. They organize wrestling and poetic competitions and play host to dance or drama parties. Communication networks emanating from the national and state capitals and other major cities have reached the far-flung villages. Television and mobile have reached out to hitherto remote rural areas, whereas radio has been since long an effective source of rural communication. On the production side of television, there is some concern for including specific programs for farmers and certain recreational items. Radio, too, has its rural programs, but the interests of the rural listeners are increasingly reported to lean towards film music. The cinema has also been a meeting point for the rural and urban people. Now, internet has made a huge entry into the rural areas, providing services through kiosks, dish TV or smart mobile phone. Thus, there is a two-way traffic in mass communications. Town is extending to reach the rural populace while the latter seeks occasion to obtain urban exposure. Access to internet seems to be more influential in exposing the rural and urban people to each other. Administrative and political dimension. Rural-urban interactions along administrative and political dimension have a long history. A village was defined as a revenue unit by the rulers in the past. The state made a number of arrangements for collecting land revenues, which gave rise to the mediating roles of the patwari, headman, zmindar, lambardar, jagirdar and the rajas. During the British rule in India, zamindars emerged as important link between the administration and the villagers. The relations between the state and the villagers have not remained smooth. A number of tribal revolts have been witnessed in India even preceding the struggle for independence. The freedom struggle was itself given a new dimension when Gandhiji recognized the poor economic position of the villagers and their role in the national economy. Within the Indian National Congress, special attention was given to the problems of the peasants, the revival of cottage industries and the spread of education, implementation of land reforms and community development, introduction of Panchayati Raj and spread of party organizations from district down to villages have all strengthened the rural-urban connections. Politics has entered into the traditional groups like village, caste and family, dividing them into factions. The mediators and brokers, mostly of political background, have come up to provide constant linkage of the rural people with the urban centers. Economic dimension. The economic relations of the villagers in the colonial past were catapulted into the arena of the international market through the cultivation of cotton and other commercial crops like jute, tea plantations in Assam with migrant labor drawn even from the tribal areas, and labor engaged in construction work for railways, roads and canals. The initial growth of industries attracted labor from areas of low agricultural productivity like eastern Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, flocking to cities like Kolkata, Ahmedabad and Bombay. Initially, people earned income in urban centers to return to their native place on retirement or at leisure. That marked the phase of semi-permanent migration. In a sense, it halted urbanization, but it contributed to urban influence in the rural areas. The Green Revolution and commercial crops introduced the market ethos within the rural setting and enabled the village and the city to draw somewhat closer. The new economic enterprises have attracted dealers of fertilizers, pesticides, advanced technology, and improved seeds to the countryside in areas of the Green Revolution. The emergence of agroservice stations has brought modern technology to the doorsteps of the farmers. New occasions have arisen for the villagers to establish links with urban markets and administrative centers for connections to the electricity grid, installation of tube wells, purchase of pump sets and oil, disposal of cane to sugar mills and grains to the market, or availing various types of loans from the state and banking agencies. Globalization started in 1990s gave a new fillip to movement of the educated youth in rural areas who took up various jobs in urban areas. At the same time, with the changing lifestyle and a growing middle class in rural areas, there is seen a greater extension of urban facilities like electricity, water, housing, road, communication, banking, trade and insurance agencies. In these rural-urban linkages, one could see various mediators as links connecting the rural with the urban and vice versa. Now, we proceed to discuss the principal links connecting the rural and the urban. 4.4.3 Principal links in the rural-urban contacts the extension of democratic and administrative order to the villages as well as the increasing mechanization of agriculture in the wake of the Green Revolution has generated important areas of activities. These areas are covered by principal mediators between the rural and the urban. The new needs of the villagers in these areas appear first among the developed sections of the villagers. But even they have to acquire the necessary skills to meet the demands of complex, formal requirements. They try to know the unknown areas and procedures of activities through the known individuals and networks. For this, they establish their connections with the formal structure through the extension of the primordial ties. The principal mediators are the rural elite and brokers working in political, legal, and economic spheres. They are tied in peculiar relationship with each other. The legal sector poses the problems which need to be resolved either through an understanding between the parties or by establishing ties with the legal and the administrative apparatus. The political leader appears in role of problem solver. The sale and purchase of machinery like tractors require knowledge of the markets, provision of finance, and the establishment of ties with the technician middlemen. In these matters, some help of political leaders as well as kinsmen is sought. The rural elite who have emerged through democratic decentralization at various levels of the rural politics are very much performing the role of principal mediators as they have to keep hold on their political constituencies. In a way, mediation offers them a constant opportunity for extending political constituencies. The brokers are drawn generally from the workers of political parties or the kinsmen with technical, legal or market knowledge. The brokers and the rural elites are also tied in social, political, and/or economic relationships which increase the effectivity of their action. Thus, rural elite and brokers constitute the principal links connecting the village with the town. These mediators are mainly from three spheres, namely legal, political, and economic. The emergence of these links between the rural and urban people is attributed to some factors that have been there since earlier times or emerging over the times. Before we proceed to discuss these factors, let me check your progress. 4.5 Factors in rural-urban linkages. Rural-urban linkages are caused by various factors. Major ones are discussed here. 1. Human migration from villages to towns and vice versa is the most important factor in linkages between the rural and the urban. Industrialization and urbanization, the two interrelated processes, have been responsible for migration of rural labor as well as absorption of villages into cities and industrial centers. 2. Development of means of transport and communication have reduced or eliminated hurdles of physical distance, time and cultural differences. 3. Extension of political and administrative institutions in rural areas has necessitated constant interactions for both the entities. 4. Expansion of market has not only arranged a space for rural-urban interactions but also contributed to commercialization of various crops and land. 5. Development initiatives for planned social change in rural areas have significant consequences for emergence of new lifestyles and social differentiation in villages. 6. Kinship connections like those of family, marriage, caste or community, and religion have traditionally facilitated rural-urban interactions, and these connections are ever present in the interactions of modern institutions as well. 7. Religious pilgrimages and cultural tours have been the traditional sources of rural-urban connections, which have received quantum jump in the wake of improved transport facilities and revolution in communication technologies. Of these factors, migration has been a unique source and ever-going process of multifarious rural-urban interactions. Let us discuss human migration and rural-urban interactions. 4.6 Human migration and rural-urban linkages. Since the primitive era, individuals, families, and groups have been migrating from one place to another for various purposes such as food, shelter, security, trade, pilgrimage, and adventure. It occurs at various levels: international, national, regional, and local. Migration has always specific meaning, factors, and impacts. Let us discuss these in the context of rural-urban interactions. 4.6.1 Concept of migration. Migration is movement of people that generally involves a change in residence from the place of origin departure to the place of destination arrival. As such, migration refers to a specific type of spatial geographical mobility, implying relatively permanent shift of residence of people from one geographical unit to another one, for example, village or town. 2. Direction of shift. 3. Causes of shift. And 4. Impact of shift on the two units, the place of departure and that of destination. Migratory movement is, therefore, not merely a physical movement of people from one place to another but also a set of social, cultural, economic, political, and other circumstances. 4.6.2 Direction of migration. In a rural-urban context, migration takes place in 4 directions, viz. Rural to rural, 2. Urban to urban, 3. Rural to urban, and 4. Urban to rural. Of these, the last two types, third and fourth, are directly related to rural-urban linkages. All over the world, people have been migrating from villages to towns, and modern forces have accentuated the process. In developing countries like India, migration is a very significant process of demographic changes and urbanization, whereas it has saturated in developed countries, where rural-urban differences are no more significant from developmental viewpoint and where many people rather like to shift their residence from city to a peaceful environment in the country. Rural side equally equipped with all modern facilities. In the developing countries, the urban-rural or reverse migration is limited only, despite the fact of the rural development witnessed with various facilities and economic resources. 4.6.3 Factors in migration. Generally, migration is caused by factors of two types, viz. Push factors and 2. Pull factors. Push factors consist of the physical, social, cultural, economic, and political conditions of relative deprivation in one or more aspects of life which force out people from the place of their origin, whereas pull factors comprise the conditions like better infrastructural facilities, rail, road, communication, electricity and market, employment, opportunities, social status, secular attitude, egalitarian values, democratic ideals, rule of law, human rights, etc. that pull attract rural people of different social layers and levels to urban centers as the destination. In fact, migration is somewhat more than simply a seasonal, cyclical, temporary or permanent movement. It represents social hierarchy in the countryside. Nature, extent and social characteristics of migration are mainly determined by 3 factors, namely macrostructural changes, social stratification, and specific conditions pertaining to specific villages and towns. Therefore, different push and pull factors combined determine unidirectional Migratory movements of different rural sections towards towns, Sharma, 1997. Unequal distribution of resources in villages is a key factor in rural migration, but it is not the landless or the poorest who migrate necessarily. There is a dualistic pattern of migration consisting of young and old, poor and rich, illiterate and highly educated, Harijans and upper castes. There is a range of the educated migrants, including the school and college dropouts, the educated with poor, moderate, good and excellent performances, and the technically trained persons. Caste, class and power background of people matters in determining migration, mobility and rural-urban connections. Acute unemployment, poverty and pauperization are more of a push factor in Indian villages. The poor may migrate more in numbers than the rich, the illiterate may leave their native places more than the educated people, and the lower caste people may have to migrate more often than the upper castes. But it does not mean that owing to their numerical preponderance among the migrants in towns and cities, the poor, the illiterate and the lower caste people establish more rural-urban connections compared to the rich, educated and upper caste migrants. The rural construction workers working in metropolises like Delhi, though substantial in number, are poor, illiterate and low caste. Their existential conditions characterized by poverty, unemployment and indebtedness, comparable with the worst slum dwellers in the city, have pushed them out of their native places. They hardly give anything to the city except their labor, and get hardly anything except the barest means of survival. Sharma 1997. Migration necessarily implies social and occupational mobility, irrespective of caste, class and education of the migrants. Not only the paupers and the educated unemployed migrate to towns and cities from villages, but also some people migrate to fulfill their cherished aspirations and ambitions, for which they lack adequate opportunities in their villages. And some others migrate for more comfort and facilities. Rural elites, including political elites from among the caste Hindus, scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, have a tendency to settle down in towns and cities. The beneficiaries of Green Revolution settle in towns and cities to upgrade themselves as businessmen and entrepreneurs. IBID. 4.6.4 Impact of migration. Human migration has its impact on both rural and urban societies, considering both geographical unit, i.e., residence and intention in peoples shifting. The impacts of migration may be broadly discussed at demographic, environmental, and social levels. Migration affects the population size in a way entirely different from that of mortality and fertility rates in the rural and urban settings. Migration causes a sudden decline in population and shortage of manpower in the village, whereas the town encounters an increased density, expansion, and growth of population. This change affects the environment, society, and culture in both the settings. The increased population pressure on the existing urban infrastructural facilities like basic amenities, housing, electricity, water and sanitation, means of transport and communication, parks, markets, schools, it results in unplanned urban growth characterized by slums, overcrowded streets, lack of basic amenities, and so on. On the other hand, the rural sector is neglected on account of the over-attention paid by planners to the urban sector. Towns, especially the capital towns like Delhi, Bangalore, Jaipur, Guwahati, etc., have witnessed maximum growth through the migration from rural areas. The demographic and environmental impacts, combined, affect the social fabric of towns in various ways. It leads to unemployment, poverty, social deviance, deterioration of law and order, discontent and political movements and upheavals. Besides, in migration from villages and expansion of urban centers by inclusion of villages and small towns located in the hinterland of big towns and cities are the two most significant factors responsible for rapid urban growth. These factors explain better the rural-urban connections and the emergence of new structures and relations. Urbanization consists of a great deal of rural material and cultural inputs, which determine the extent of impact of urban values, attitudes, and behavioral patterns on the rural population. Clear-eyed migration establishes rural-urban linkages to a great extent. The linkages do bring about certain changes in the rural and urban life. However, one can still see continuity of traditional elements in both the societies. Before proceeding further, let me check your progress in learning. 4.7 Continuity and change in rural and urban societies. As the foregoing discussion revealed, there is a rural component in the urban society, infused through migration, and an urban component in the rural society in the wake of increased activity of development, democratic decentralization, and revolution in communication technology. Thus, both the societies are changing, yet at the same time structural and cultural continuity is also visible, which may be discussed at three structural levels, namely I. Social structure, 2. Economic structure, and 3. Power structure. The traditional institutions like family, caste, kinship, marriage, religion, and ethnicity are still playing an active role in both the societies. The presence of these traditional institutions, along with new groups like class, club, and occupational associations in Indian towns and cities, exhibits a low level of urbanization of the social structure. The rapid urban growth in India is caused by I. Migration from villages, and 2. Expansion of urban centers by inclusion of villages and small towns located in the hinterland of big towns and cities, and this kind of urbanization extends the same social hierarchy and institutional forms to the urban space, creating a large domain of shared continuity. As a result, though the urban attitudes, lifestyle, and behavior patterns reflect a greater change, it is also multi-layered in the presence of multiple hierarchies in the population. Likewise, the cultural diffusion in the villages is also differentially distributed. Similarly, today the rural and urban economic structure show a greater change, but there exist significant continuities. The urban occupational structure mostly comprises secondary and tertiary occupations, and its technical and professional base has significantly increased. Yet, the small towns still draw much from the primary and traditional occupations. The traditional occupational relationship is evident even in towns of various sizes. In the rural society, elimination of Zmindri system and implementation of land reforms have resulted in a new agrarian structure of a few strata, broadly, the upper, middle, and lower, as compared to multiple strata in the traditional structure, and has less exploitative relationship and less physical and social distance between the strata. Yet, the institutionalized inequalities of caste and gender are still continuing. In both the societies, occupational differentiation is evident, but the occupational distribution is still mediated by traditional institutions. Today, the democratic power structure based on universal adult franchise signifies a totally new form of governance wherein political parties have an important role in its structuring and functioning. When the social background of power holders is looked into, the traditional social institutions like caste, kinship, religion, and ethnicity are found very much active in political mobilization of people in the political parties and other political institutions, resulting in traditionalization of the new institutions. Thus, one could see institutional continuity in all the structures of the two societies. Nonetheless, various changes, especially in the material and technological life, have also occurred through diffusion of culture, even in the rural society. Yet the social institutions extended through the rural-urban migration and linkages have rendered the rural society without a transformative impact from the urban society. Now, Before we summarize the discussion, let me check your progress in learning. 4.8 Summary. Rural-urban linkages refer to socio-cultural, political, and economic connections manifested between the rural and urban people, established in both the traditional and modern sectors. Modern political and economic changes have generated new areas of activities wherein even the developed sections of the villagers lack knowledge and urban contacts. Therefore, the rural elite and brokers become the principal links in connecting the rural with the urban to solve their political, legal, and economic problems. However, many of the bases of the rural-urban linkages are still traditional, resulting in the structural continuity in the rural and urban societies in India, along with certain changes. Thank you. Subscribe to our channel for more updates, and we will see you with the next chapter.